After her father's arrest, Cecile took part in the leadership of the party organization of the Orb department, despite the fact that she was expecting a child and was not in good health. In July 1941, she was elected secretary of the party organization in the Marne department, which was already underground. Renee told us that Sekelo and Mama Edwidge were in Reims, and on the morning of July 29, I left by train for Reims. Pierre Forney and Raymond Petronin, Renee promised to put them in touch with the party organization of the Department of Orb. Armand Gandon was to escort them to the farm of our friends, where they were to wait until reliable documents were produced. At 9 o'clock on the evening of July 29, I knocked at Madame Marshall's apartment. Under this assumed name, Cecile and her mother had rented an apartment on the first floor of one of the crowded quarters of Reims. Light streamed through the glass door. Both women were getting ready for bed. Cecile was rereading my last letter from the concentration camp, forwarded to her by René Romegan from St. Julian. Hey, I assure you that the phrase "the countryside is beautiful" in August's means that he is going to escape from the camp next month. She explained to Edwidge. Oh, Cecile, I said in a whisper at the very door. Edwidge and Cecile looked at each other. No one knew their address, neither Boulanger nor Bougouglia, the regional functionaries of the Communist Party, much less the comrades from Reims. Who could have been there at that time? Edwidge and Cecile did not open to me at once. They had to get dressed and hide the leaflets and other compromising documents in a safe place. Cecile opened the door, and I embraced her. It was easy to understand our excitement, our joy. We had known each other for a little over 2 years. On the day I left for the front at the beginning of October 1939, she came to Juanway. Then we saw each other only during my 2-week vacation in January 1940, and on May 11, 1940, we were married in Virieux-les-Grand. What a time we chose to start a family. After the wedding, Cecile returned to Paris, and I went back to my regiment in Alsace. I arrived just as the regiment was moving to the Somme. Had I delayed a few hours, everything might have changed. I would not have had to become a prisoner of concentration camp 17B. On that July night in 1941, we did not go to bed at all. When the first rays of the morning sun showed, our conversation was still going on. I learned that my son Maurice, whom I had only seen on a photocard, was at his grandmother's house in Virieux-les-Grand. The child would not have endured the difficult material conditions and constant dangers of his mother's illegal stay. Cecile showed me recent photographs of my mother holding her grandson in her arms. I recognized the familiar landscapes of the Bugis of the Virieux-les-Grands Valley, where I had spent part of my youth. Boxwood, fine stone and vineyards were visible everywhere. Cecile told me how her father had been arrested. The police showed up when she was about to give birth. Little Maurice was born 3 weeks after the police took his grandfather Maurice Romagan away. Of Romagan's 2 sons, the younger, Raymond, a.k. Roland, and later Romain, remained at large. In 1940, when he was 19 years old, at the last pre-war Congress of the Union of Communist Youth, held in Issy-les-Moulineaux, he became a member of the Central Committee of this organization. After the defeat of France in June 1940, Raymond was in the southern, unoccupied part of the country. Occasional postcards came from him. "I am well. Your loving nephew Serge." This meant I am alive, at large, fighting. Together with Victor Joannes, Raymond Romagan became one of the organizers of the Underground Union of Communist Youth in the unoccupied part of France. From Cecile, I learned that my brother Marcel, like me, had been taken prisoner and that he had been taken to Germany. This was the news about my family that awaited me. At this critical moment, I really wanted to know if the resistance movement was organized in France. Cecile explained that since June 1940, the party had been constantly explaining its position in illegally published newspapers and fighting against the occupiers. From the newspapers, I learned of General de Gaulle's statement. What about the Gaullists? I asked Cecile. What are your relations with them? Is cooperation possible? I feel obliged to give, if only briefly, the content of the answer I heard that July night in 1941. There are Gaullists in Reims. Do you think they are not the same rich men who in their estates before the war received delegations of Hitler's youth? It is true that we know the Gaullists from the free professions and the middle bourgeoisie of Reims, and we try to establish contacts with them. They gather in cafes, discuss London radio programs, but that is the end of their activities. We're trying to get them to work together. So far, our relations are not It is a fact that patriots have already died in camps, prisons, on gallows, including communists, Gaullists, and representatives of other circles. But the French Communist Party in these early years was the only truly formalized large national organization that fought throughout the country. About 9 o'clock in the morning, Cecile went to meet the Reims trackman in charge of organizational work. He was to carry out a series of activities to strengthen sabotage and the creation of armed groups. Edwidge was also to meet with comrades. I spent the whole morning alone in this small, my first safe house. Before the joyous days of the liberation of Paris, Cecile and I had to change many such apartments. One day we counted, and it turned out that there were about 25. Mother and daughter had to leave Troyes without attracting attention. The house, for the purchase of which the father had worked all his life, had to be sold to pay the fines. The furniture, for the sake of preservation, we gave to friends. Cecile and Edwidge took with them only some linen, some kitchen utensils, and 2 mattresses. In Reims they bought a table, 4 chairs, a second-hand portable stove. The kitchen looked more than modest. The bedroom had only 2 mattresses, spread out directly on the floor. There was another problem: how to get sustenance. You had to have a ration card to buy any food. Living illegally, Cecile and Edwidge used coupons given to them by their comrades, snatching it from their meagre rations. In the following days, Cecile met with a functionary of the Union of Communist Youth from the international committee which operated in the Marne, Orbe, Yonne, Côte d'Or, and parts of the other departments. Cecile informed him of my return from captivity. "So tell the comrades in the leadership that Zuzu has returned," I asked her. Before the war, when I was a member of the National Bureau of the Union of Communist Youth, comrades called me by that name. Back in Paris, our young comrade met with Danielle Casanova and told her about my escape. "Leave all business," Danielle told him. "Get on the train. Go to him and tell him that I'm waiting for him at noon on August 2 at the Closerie de Lille Café at the Port Royal metro station." On August 2, I was at the meeting place at this fashionable café. Danielle had been here probably back in the days when she was a medical student. On this sunny August day, I was wearing flannel pants, a blouse, and sailcloth shoes. It had been less than a week since I'd escaped from the camp, and today I could enjoy the air of freedom. Danielle was 32 years old. I was 26. We had known each other since 1934, had been in the leadership of the Union of Communist Youth together, had been together in 1935 in Moscow at the Grand Congress of the Communist Youth International, where Raymond Gouillet had been elected General Secretary. There we proclaimed the idea of mobilizing the broad masses of workers to fight against the growing threat of fascism. We were united by a long-standing friendship. It became even stronger in the first months of the war, when Cecile, under Danielle's leadership, provided liaison with party activists in the army. The last time I spoke with Danielle was in mid-May 1940, shortly after my marriage. At that meeting she told me about the party's task of rolling out work in the army throughout the country. In 1941, Danielle was hiding under the name Anna. She was tireless. She travelled a lot in Paris, carrying out tasks to direct the activities of underground organizations of the FCP. She worked among women, youth and intellectuals. For all she had enough Zadora attention, and therefore she was universally loved. After paying the bill, we left the café and went to Montparnasse to meet André Leroy. André Leroy and Camille Baynac were in charge of the activities of the Union of Communist Youth in the Northern Zone. The massive withdrawal of German troops from France opens up new opportunities for us. "We must expand the armed struggle," she told me. "The Union of Communist Youth has created battalions of youth. The command of them we want to entrust you." I replied that I was not very competent in military matters and expressed my fear that I would not be able to cope with the task, especially since such forms of struggle were new to us at that time. Andel said, smiling, "You have successfully accomplished such a daring escape. The party leadership, to whom I reported it, considers your candidacy suitable for this. In addition, your deputy will be a comrade from the Central Committee of the Union of Communist Youth, who fought in Spain. He will provide you with substantial assistance in military matters. This is Pierre Georges, one of the functionaries of our union in the Southern Zone. We've summoned him here. The police were looking for him there, and he's needed more in Paris." Danielle left me with André Leroy. He gave me a ration card and a tobacco card. I haven't smoked at all for over a year, and now I'm back to the habit. You have to attach yourself to a tobacco kiosk, André Leroy explained to me. Take a picture, I'll order an ID card and get some money to pay your rent. You'd better get a room in one of the bourgeois neighbourhoods, because in them the police surveillance is not as intense as in the working-class districts. And one more thing, no one must know your address, not Danielle and especially not Cecil. Around noon, André led me to the Duroc metro station. There, leaning against the railing at the subway entrance, Pierre Georges was waiting for us. He was later known as Colonel Fabian. In the days of the Paris uprising, he was one of the most authoritative leaders of the headquarters of the organization French Frontières et Partisans Paris district. From that day in August 1941, and until the last day of his life, in December 1944, when Fabian already commanded on the Alsace front of the 1st Paris Brigade, we were bound together by a strong friendship forged in hard struggle and mutual brotherly love. I needed a pseudonym, and André Leroy said, "We'll call you Marceau." This name seemed too loud to me, and I suggested calling me Mark. "Let it be Mark," André agreed. This name reminded me of the hero of one of my favourite books. The novel Enchanted Soul Romain Roland. The desire to fight against fascism had been in my whole being since I was 17. The same was true of Mark, who died in Florence at the dagger of fascist Mussolini's hired assassins. For a long time, when I led the first groups of frontiereros from the battalions of youth, was a member of the National Committee of the Special Organization, a member of the National Military Committee of the French Frontiereros and Partisans. I was called Mark. In 1944, I became Colonel André. For 13 months, I was a prisoner of war. When I returned home, I saw that France had been plundered. I had the opportunity to read illegally published party propaganda materials. With great excitement, I again read Humanite, looked at leaflets printed on low-grade paper. We discussed various problems with comrades, visited working-class neighbourhoods and held talks. All this made it possible to quickly determine how extensively, using their Vichy collaborators, the Nazis were carrying out the enslavement of the country. Paris was surrendered without a fight. Along with German troops on that mournful day of June 14, 1940, the first Gestapo units arrived here, led by Notion, to carry out reprisals. General Stressius, a former advisor to Chiang Kai-shek, was appointed the first German military commandant of occupied France. On June 30, he and his staff were stationed at the Hotel Majestic. On November 1, 1940, he was succeeded by General Otto von Stulpnagel. On July 16, 1940, Hitler outlined the beginning of the invasion of England and at the same time gave orders to prepare an attack on the Soviet Union. This is confirmed by the directive, which was called Order No. 17 on August 1, 1940. Having made this decision, Hitler carried out a series of activities aimed at strengthening Nazi domination in Europe. On October 22, 23 and 24, he met alternately in Montoire with Laval, in Endare with Franco and again in Montoire with Pétain. Laval and their circle invented the term cooperation. In reality, it was a matter of giving France into slavery to the Nazi victor. After complete victory, Hitler intended to reclaim and Germanize a large part of France and turn the rest of the country into an agricultural colony and a place of entertainment for the Nazi overlords. At a gathering of Nazi ringleaders on April 30, 1942, if the French knew what the Führer would demand of them, their eyes would probably pop out of their heads. After the war, France was to be punished by destroying its major industries. It would thus become almost entirely an agricultural country, and the Vichy rulers had already begun to mould public opinion in a spirit pleasing to the Nazis. In the summer of 1940, Pétain preached a return to the land. Only the land will not deceive. It will remain our refuge. And on July 9, 1940, Laval specified, merged with the continental system of production and commerce, France will be primarily agricultural and peasant. It was not yet time to put this post-war plan into practice. The war was not over. Hitler needed France's industrial base to equip and supply arms and ammunition for the huge army he was preparing to attack the Soviet Union. He set out to either turn the French into slaves in their own country or send them by force to work in Germany. It is desirable, Goebbels ended his speech on April 30, 1942, to keep now all this secret and to achieve the maximum benefit. This is not such a difficult task when one has people at hand in Vichy. Charles Spinners, in a leading article in the newspaper Lieu for September 28, 1940, wrote, "Our continental position will constantly oblige us to enter the Europe that Germany creates." Bitain, in turn, in a conversation with Alphonse Chateaubriand, director of the pseudo-literary Nazi weekly Le Gerbe, explained how he understood cooperation and a future Europe led by Germany. Cooperation will be the fusion that binds together the vital economic and cultural aspects. In a speech in Munich on November 10, 1940, Hitler responded to these remarks by a head of state daring to consider himself French. "At present we have the opportunity to mobilize almost the whole of Europe, and it can be said that I will do it on the basis of the interests of industrial circles." The representatives of the big cartels of France carried out this mobilization not only with great understanding, but also with genuine enthusiasms. War or peace, all the same, capital and multinational industry will provide them with prosperity on both sides of the Rhine. Even during the period of the Strange War, the illegally published newspaper Humanite gave the example of how French iron ore fed the steel works of the Führer. The transportation was done in full view of the world through neutral countries. The ore returned to us in 1940 in the form of shells and bullets fired from German guns, rifles and machine guns. Beginning in July 1940, these old ties, dangerous to nations, operated openly. The lords of German industry or their representatives followed on the heels of the Wehrmacht troops. On August 9, 1940, the French Varnish and Paint Syndicate agreed with the German Joint Stock Company, IG Farben Industry, to renew the pre-war agreement that had spawned the cartel. Chemical Trust Kuhlmann and the German trust IG Farben formed in March 1941 in France, the company Francola. To outwardly preserve decorum, a Frenchman was appointed its president, and the owners were Germans owning 51%. In January 1941, half of the factories in the occupied zone were already fully working for Germany. In March 1941, 70% of the steel industry in both zones of the country was put at the service of the Nazis. In the following years, this percentage increased steadily. The lion's share of bauxite and aluminum production was sent over the Rhine, and in June 1941, an agreement was signed providing for the transfer to Germany of 5 out of every 6 airplanes produced by France. Louis Renault, owner of factories for the production of cars, trucks, tanks and similar equipment in Boulogne-Billancourt, who in 1939 went to America, after the establishment of the Nazi occupation regime, hastily returned to France and without delay, without waiting for an invitation from the Germans, offered to put at their disposal a tank factory. Later, most if not all of the products manufactured by Renault's plants were supplied to Hitler's army. Alas, Renault was not alone. In the issue of the newspaper Humanité for May 8, 1941, reported that Legide, on behalf of the Association of French Entrepreneurs, signed an agreement with the German and Italian associations, which concerned the entire automotive industry in France. The report of the competent German authorities stated that French supplies alone in 1941 enabled Germany to form 18 tank and 40 infantry divisions. During the winter campaign of 1942, the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front received from France 2,500 airplanes, 300 submarines and 2/3 of the total amount of winter equipment for personnel. Soviet Aviation Major General M. Gromov, at the end of January 1942, wrote, "It should be noted that in the last 3 months, of the 3,229 enemy planes destroyed, a considerable part of the fighters, scouts and bombers were built in French factories, it being of no consequence that they are German models. French engines of various types are put on German planes. Technically, they are very easy to recognize. We have also discovered a great deal of French aircraft equipment, Otto Abetz, during a number of pre-war years. Together with the Committee France, Germany laid the foundations of cooperation and prepared in advance treacherous actions of senior French officials in various spheres. Abetz, former German ambassador to Paris throughout the occupation, stated in 1950 under interrogation, Germany could not have obtained, even by force, even partially, the supplies that were fulfilled by the French Vichy government. At the same time, the consent to the use of French prisoners of war in German war factories, given by that government, meant aid which cannot be overestimated. The famous writer John Richard Bloch, who worked as an announcer on Moscow radio during the occupation, said in a July 3, 1943 broadcast, about an exhibition of German military equipment captured by the Soviet Army. The equipment are designed to destroy the Russians, has French branding, Citroën Dunlops, Goodrich, Michaelichin. Here is the tank fleet. On the armour of one of the tanks is a sign of the company Saint-Chamond. Others were made by the factory Creusot in Führer. German soldiers are usually delivered to the battlefield trucks firms Peugeot, Renault, Lafley, assembled on the Michelin Confort. For 2 years now, the Goodrich firm of Culm has been supplying spikes for German heavy trucks without interruption. In Clermont-Ferrand, the chimneys of the Michelin companies are continuously smoking. Citroën Gotchkis Samoa, Hispano-Suiza, Nomi Ron is constantly in service. At the end of the programme, Jean-Richard Bloch called on all workers and patriots of France to disrupt the production of military products, not to wait for the enterprises to be hit by Anglo-American airstrikes. Never before, neither before the Nazi occupation nor after it, had the big industrial cartels and financial oligarchies known such a lush flourishing. The traitor Dorio's newspaper, the Credu People, on February 16, 1941, posted a very revealing interview in this respect with the director of the Ericsson firm in Colombo. "We can only rejoice in our cooperation with German industrialists," said the director. "We shall soon have 2,000 workers, as against 1,300 before the war and 1,900 in 1939-1940. German industry has been given the great advantage of freedom of action. It has the opportunity to secure the stable operation of its factories and to renew its basic production assets." Some entrepreneurs, especially among the small and medium-sized ones, resisted the occupiers. However, this cannot be said of the vast majority of large French industrialists. During the materials of the interrogation of the Gestapo chief in France, Neukölln, under the heading Information, Raw Material Resources, there is such a report. We received information about raw material resources from the head of our military administration in the occupied territories, as well as on the French side from here Neukölln names a certain important person, a well-known owner of a large stable of racehorses. Unfortunately, the amnesty law does not allow us to reveal his name. We'll call him Mr. X. I became acquainted with Mr. X. Continues the chief of the Gestapo. Through Moloch, who he often visited in the apartment of the latter, Mr. X. Approved of Laval's policy, but reproached him for his lack of energy, and especially for his careless attitude to the management of the country's economy. In general, he reproached Laval not for what he did, but for what he did not do. Mr. X. Was an advocate of unlimited cooperation. Mr. X. Supplied us with very important information, as he was one of the leaders of French industry and economy, had the opportunity to receive it from various high-ranking political, industrial and other figures, whom he knew personally and often visited. The same interrogation was about the famous mineral drink, which brought the Germans a lot of income. The owner of the enterprise often invited Neukölln to his country house for the weekend, where they feasted, drinking the excellent drink. Mr. X. Did not even think about the fact that his guest subordinates were massacring French patriots during the same hours. As economic collaborationism unfolded, in addition to the heavy burden of exploitation by their predatory businessmen and their servile state, an even heavier burden, the burden of occupation, was added to the workers' shoulders. This is not 1936, the big industrialist told the workers. They frightened the workers with expulsion to Germany, the punitive measures of the occupation authorities and the Gestapo, with the help of the trade and industrial cartels, the financial oligarchy, the technocrats and the traitors in Vichy. France was being turned into a Nazi colony. In August 1940, wrote in Richard Bloch, following a grey wave of soldiers, German civilian economics specialists appeared in Paris. Following them soon came industrialists, bankers, merchants of all stripes. They poured thousands, tens of thousands into the economy of a country whose doors were open to them. And I can assure you that they were, in their opinion, doing a good job. They worked, as it is customary in their country, thoroughly, with their usual diligence. A 10-hour working day, no slothfulness, and for this they rewarded themselves with enormous evening drinks in the night cafes. The exchange rate of the mark was set arbitrarily. 1 mark equaled 20 francs. This meant that France had to pay the occupiers 400 million francs a day, and with this money gentlemen, officials, soldiers, non-commissioned officers and officers of the Wehrmacht literally looted all the stores. Jean-Richard Bloch dubbed them men with suitcases. He showed how they hurried to Parisian stores, small and large, buying everything, robbing the country to the last thread, and having done their job, departed back home, laden with rolls and stuffed to the brim with suitcases. The collaborationist newspaper Lever, in the issue of December 2, 1940, shamelessly presented them to us on the front page. They were seated at the racecourse in Auteuil, accompanied by fur-clad ladies and collaborating industrialists. Among the next, the whole Parisian high society was gathered here. The city sweepstakes functioned smoothly. The festivities at Auteuil. The public's sympathies are divided between the stables of Brignac and Boussac. Minus the small number of Frenchmen who participated in the plundering of their own country by black market dealings and by putting their factories at the service of Germany, the vast majority of our people at the same time were forced to submit to the legalized harsh card system. All products were sold on cards. Everything was rationed, even milk for children. Child mortality increased and reached 30%. These norms were further cut again for all categories. For workers, the norm was first set at 275 G and then 250 G bread, which formed the bulk of the diet of the French in the large cities, was almost inedible. It was baked from anything but wheat or rye flour. Consumption of such ersatz bread made people sick with what was known as bread scabies. On March 31, 1941, the weekly meat allowance was 360 G with bones and 288 G without bones. Later it gradually decreased to 180 G of meat per week. Rutabaga chowder and earthy pear became the national dish. A worker's monthly salary would not be enough for one meal in a restaurant, and the collaborationist newspaper Livre, in addition to advertising restaurants that use black market goods, on December 28, 1940, cynically wrote, "Let us discover the rutabaga, this beautiful vegetable, which was abhorred in peacetime." Further, in this public libel it was comically, but in the spirit of the time, broadcast. "You will not lose weight if you take Pink's pills containing iron." On November 25, 1940, the same newspaper triumphantly reported, "It became possible in 1 month to give 2 million kilograms of potatoes to 2 million Parisians. Sugar was also rationed, 500 grams per person per. We had to drink ersatz coffee, which did not contain a single coffee bean, and sweeten it with suction. The Nazis took away leather, wool, cotton, linen. We had to wear fibre suits that shrank at the slightest rain as if they had been washed. Pants and sleeves became shorter by several centimetres. Shoes were made of synthetic rubber. Women and girls wore shoes with wooden soles. There was no gasoline, so cars, cabs and trucks stood idling. Paris buses were fueled by gas. A few old charcoal gas generators were used by merchants and transportation agents. Cabs were replaced by bicycle cabs. A bicycle with a trailer that held a passenger. Leg muscles replaced fuel. Even in its appearance, our country resembled a colony for what looked more like a Saigon rickshaw than a 1940-1944 Parisian bicycle cab. The worst colonization was ideological. Anti-communism, anti-Semitism. Opposition to the Popular Front and its program drew away a certain part of the French, who themselves became agents of Nazi propaganda. Weakness completed the rest, but this was nothing new. If there was anything new compared to before the war, it was that they were now trying to present Hitler's ideology as completely revolutionary. On April 3, 1941, the Reverend Father Gores had the audacity to write in the Cri du People newspaper, "Alas, the relative purity, homogeneity and beauty of the race constitute an exciting, favourable national factor. There is a semblance of race in France. The descendants of the Gauls are always ready to put up with pernicious parliamentarism and are at times partially afflicted with tuberculosis, alcoholism and syphilis. In France, race is a rather unfavourable national factor. It needs the domination of a super-racial strong religion." On November 23, 1940 in Paris, Riechleiter Rosenberg, the Führer's confidant for supreme supervision of ideological training and education in the National Socialist Party of Germany, spoke in the Chamber of Deputies, in front of German high-ranking military and civilian officials sitting in the chairs of French deputies. And suddenly this thinker of Hitler began to broadcast about the end of democracy, about the victory of blood over gold. "We led," he said, "a frontal attack on liberalism and Marxism, on the Jews and Freemasonry. The era of the principles of 1789 is at an end. They have been defeated on the battlefields of Flanders, northern France and Lorraine. Out of chaos, poverty, and shamelessness, a racial ideal had suddenly arisen to oppose the international idea. The victory of this ideal in all spheres represents the true world revolution of the 20th century. Despite the difficulties of working underground, the FKP published and secretly distributed a pamphlet entitled Revolution and Counter-Revolution of the 20th Century between January and February 1941, written by the young philosopher Georges Politzer. It contained a sharp rebuke to the findings of the Nazi theorist Rosenberg. Since this pamphlet is little known these days, I will allow myself to quote a few excerpts. The French Revolution is a glorious page in the history of the people of France. It is especially important to note this now, when French capitalism is giving up the nation to the oppression of foreign imperialism. Rosenberg's speech demanded a response. French Marxists, or rather communists, gave such an answer. It was both natural and important. The active struggle against all spiritual colonization, symbolized by Rosenberg's arrival, is inseparable from the struggle for the freedom and independence of France. The FCP is proud to be at the forefront of this struggle. The fact that it is the French communists, and only they, who are giving Rosenberg the answer simultaneously proves the validity of the claims that the defeat has led to the ideological collapse of all other parties. Rosenberg came to Paris to settle accounts with the ideas of 1789. Settling accounts also means the final explanation. Rosenberg's last explanation with 1789 must turn into the first explanation with Nazism. Georges Politzer shows in 85 pages, written sharply and extremely well argued, what Nazism means, what it hides behind a verbal screen. The finding lies in the myth of blood. By calling for a war of blood against gold, Rosenberg tries to assure that capitalist Germany is waging an anti-capitalist war. Hitler even agreed to a war of two worlds. But has Germany destroyed the division of society into exploited and exploiters? He eliminated classes mentally by appealing to the consciousness of the people of the AL1 race, to its numerically superior power, and this he calls the secret blood. Georges Politzer further raises his voice in an indictment on behalf of the French people. From the starving people, tribute is collected to support the occupying troops. He exposes the policies leading to inflation, for which ordinary people must pay the price. Thus, the fund of savings, the purchasing power of earnings or wages, pensions and unemployment benefits disappear before our eyes. To levy taxes on the poorest strata of the oppressed people. To plan to increase the taxes, to impose unbearable financial burdens under the guise of reparation. This is what the essence of the myth of blood and gold has turned out to be for France. Does the struggle against gold amount to the dismemberment of France? France is cut into two parts. The occupied zone includes the departments of Nord, Pas-de-Calais, Ardennes, as in the Middle Ages, outposts rise on all sides, paralyzing economic life, impeding the movement of people and goods, disorganizing supplies, increasing poverty more and more every day. To economic exploitation and political enslavement is added national oppression. In the occupied zone, the French are forbidden to have their own press, their own organizations. They now have no right even to education. In the unoccupied zone, the puppet Vichy government carries out the orders of the occupiers. French schools are placed under the control of Hitler's Reich with the blessing and assistance of the Vichyaists. In some lycees, German officers are already present in history classes to supervise the teachers. Georges Politzer contrasts racism and obscurantism with humanism and science. Rosenberg boasted that his myths were the highest achievement of 4 centuries of German intellectual development. In fact, we know that racism has nothing to do with the great German intellectual traditions of Goethe, Beethoven, Hegel, Karl Marx, and Friedrich Engels. With his insulting attacks on the French Revolution, Rosenberg confirms that he is fighting against German thought, whose greatest representatives have always preached adoration and admiration for 18th century France, and its great feat of overturning feudalism. With his discovery, Rosenberg is trying to substitute knowledge directed toward truth with knowledge directed toward illusion. What Rosenberg's philosophical revolution practically represents can be seen in the attitude toward science, intellectual activity, and intellectuals in Germany itself. What cultural level is evidenced by concentration camps for workers and revolutionary intellectuals, by anti-Semitism and the persecution of Negroes, by the oppression of peoples, by the deprivation of all their freedoms? Georges Politzer concludes, "That is why, in France, oppressed, condemned to exploitation and slavery, the Communist Party calls on the French nation to unite for freedom and independence." A year later, a major philosopher was arrested, subjected to particularly sophisticated torture, and shot in May 1942. In April 1941, a pamphlet entitled "No, Nazism is not Socialism" was printed illegally. Its author was Gabriel Péry. On May 18, 1941, he was arrested and shot on December 15. In his last letter, "Let my friends know that I have remained faithful to the ideal of my life. Let my countrymen know that I am dying for France to live. For the last time I ask a question of my conscience, and the answer is only affirmative. If I had to begin again, I would go the same way." On this night, I keep thinking that Paul Vaillant-Couturier was right when he said that communism is the youth of the world, that it alone creates a happy future. I feel strong enough to face death. Farewell. Long live France. Péry's pamphlet, following Politzer's, overthrew the system of Nazism and called for a struggle against the occupiers. A talented journalist and worthy philosopher, Gabriel Péry, I wrote. To make the illusion complete, they loaded onto their galley a number of former socialist smugglers, fugitive neo-socialists and corrupt syndicalists. These good-hearted apostles assure us that it is necessary without a single delay to be ready for a salutary injection from neighbouring countries, which are, you have probably already guessed it, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. It turns out that for a number of years Hitler and Mussolini have been brazenly slandered by someone. Gabriel Péry showed how Nazism came to power in Germany, financed by the big corporations and the German financial oligarchy, as well as the English oilman Sir Henry Detterding and some of America's overlords like Ford. But all this would not be enough to establish Nazi domination in Germany. We should not delude ourselves that the desire and money of a few magnates would have been enough to ensure the victory of this gang. Its champions had to acquire the confidence of a considerable mass of people in order to achieve victory. The question is of great importance. The point is that it was possible to realize a monstrous violence against the masses. Gabriel Péry then explained how this happened. The economic crisis had thrown the middle classes into complete confusion. The fall in the value of the mark had squeezed the last juices out of depositors who had stable incomes. The merchants were being strangled by bank charges and cartelized big stores. The peasants fell into debt. Mass unemployment began. Extremely impoverished war veterans and young people who could not find work, in these conditions, became obedient victims of fascism. This happened at a time of deep division between German socialists and communists, when the unity of the proletariat was so necessary, which could become an attractive force for all the victims of fascism and, combining unity with active action, could find a way out of the crisis. Gabriel Péry refuted the fiction that Nazism after 1933 supposedly improved the situation of German workers. After 1933, the impoverishment of the German working class continued. While the Nazis were in power, wages fell by 25 to 35%. These wages were further reduced by so-called voluntary taxes, 20% of which were allocated to Nazi creations. Péry cited a number of data, which convincingly confirmed the increased exploitation of the German people and increased material hardship after Hitler's rise to power. He went on to talk about the enslavement of France by the Nazi occupiers. This enslavement was dubbed collaboration, but everything that was written in the course of 6 months, and even more so the facts, not the press, enabled the French, who had not succumbed to transient stupidity, to visualize the essence of collaboration with the utmost clarity. The most frank and, let us say boldly, the most orthodox definition of cooperation was given by Marcel D. I will readily define the essence of cooperation. It consists in helping the victor to achieve total victory. Gabriel Péry expounds on the meaning of in the sense of his achieving total victory. The victors are usually cunning enough not to trust their cowardly submissive commissioners to supervise the slaves, and these characterless creatures in most cases do their work to the detriment of their own people in an extremely ruthless and severe manner, as no foreign overseer appointed to a defeated country could do. This is the conclusion Gabriel Péry came to. The communists know that their cause is the cause of all peoples languishing under the German boot. They feel themselves bound by the closest ties to the patriots who are fighting the same battle at all times, with the same end against those who fill the prisons with which Himmler has dotted all Europe. When these patriots stand before a court of law, obediently carrying out the orders of the executioners, they proclaim their faith in the beautiful future of their country. Communists are the true internationalists and patriots. We know that France will become even more beautiful, free and respected as soon as the peoples of Europe gain independence and unite for the noble purpose of helping each other. So, at the beginning of 1941, the main direction of the underground struggle became substantially clearer. From the Latin Quarter to Place Etoile, the first battles with the occupiers took place in enterprises, in the sphere of public services, in universities, lyceums and other educational institutions, where the majority of workers, teachers, and young people were concentrated. The actions of intellectuals, teachers, pupils and students in defense of culture and education were characterized by greater unity than those of other strata, because it was these people who were destined to begin the struggle for national independence, for freedom of opinion and expression, in defense of the human person. In July 1940, the rector of the University of Paris announced the resumption of classes. This was to prevent the classrooms from being taken over by the occupiers. Other institutes and lycees followed the Sorbonne's example. There was even talk of special examination sessions to replace those missed due to the hostilities. These measures reduced control over the classrooms, which students and lycée students used to organize resistance to the occupiers. But the Germans did not waste time in vain either. Dr. Epting, one of the servants of Nazism, was appointed rector of the University of Paris. The Vicchyists and the occupiers organized lectures in the huge auditorium of the Sorbonne University, which were attended by the cream of the entire collaborating Paris. The scientist Georges Claude and the academician Abel Bonnard, who later became Petain's minister, gave speeches in defense of collaboration. But already in the first months of these lectures, leaflets flew from the upper rows of the Sorbonne's great lecture hall. They were signed, the Communist Union of Students and Lycées of France. Some students were arrested during these first demonstrations in July and August 1940. Christian Rizot and Raymond Etimo were sentenced to 8 months in prison. The National Board of the Communist Union of Students and Lycée students at the time included Francis Cohen, Suzanne Gion and François Lescure. We had a constant direct link, Francis Cohen testifies, with the Communist Party leadership through Victor Joannes, then General Secretary of the Union of Communist Youth. After Victor Joannes left for Lyon to take charge of the Union of Communist Youth in the southern zone of the country, this communication was carried on through Maurice Berlemans, alias Richard. In Paris, about 60 communist students were organizationally assigned to various faculties. They worked in groups of 3, which provided an effective combination of legal and illegal activities. Very few survived. Most were shot or died in concentration camps in Germany. At the Sorbonne, the organization was led by Claude Lalayette and Olivier Suif, who had previously headed the Lycée de Paris organization. Bernard Kirchen, editor of the underground newspaper of students and lycée students Relève, was appointed to the literary section. Other leaders included Tony Bloncourt, Christian Rizot, Pierre Dier, Pierre Cast, Gisèle Vellepin, Oman Ben Alaya, and Imre Martin. Jean Canal and Raymond Etimo led the work in the history sector. André Diez worked with students in the Faculty of Natural Sciences. This remarkable partisan died at Mont Valérien. The Faculty of Medicine was assigned to Picard, Martini, and our dear Jean Rossignol, who later became the first doctor in the battalions of youth, their brave fighter. He was arrested by the Nazis, sent to Mauthausen concentration camp and died there. Jean Kommer was the liaison with the Faculty of Fine Arts. He was not a communist, but he was a member of our student organization, which fought against the occupiers. This example is not isolated, especially in the period 1940-1942, when only the party, the Union of Communist Youth, and the organizations it created worked closely together in work that took on a national scale. To cite just a few names from the hundreds of activists who worked in the lycées of Paris: Guy Moquet, communist leader of the Lycée Carnot in the XVI arrondissement. He was arrested on October 13, 1940 at a conspiratorial meeting after distributing leaflets and shot on October 22, 1941 in Chateaubriand. At the Lycée Buffon, the communists were led by Pierre Benoit, Jean Arthus, Jean Bédry, Pierre Grillo, and Lucien Legros. They were all shot on February 5 and 8, 1943. Ivan Denis worked at the Lycée Janssen de Sailly, André Kirchen at the Lycée Pasteur, Marius Kiai at the Colbert High School. Many more names could be mentioned. Most of these comrades perished. So from the first months of the occupation in the universities, lycées and colleges of Paris, the young communists had their organizations and were active under their leadership. Students, lycée students and pupils illegally distributed the newspapers Relève and L'Avant-Garde. In addition to illegal work, the communist students carried on legal work with great courage. François Lescure, a member of the National Board of the Communist Union of Students and Lycées of France, who was officially president of the Shop Association of Students of Humanities Faculties, was entrusted with the task of leading the work of this organization throughout the occupied zone. There were several of us, Lescure writes, who wanted to do everything possible to ensure that our union would not get bogged down in collaborationism, that it would serve as long as possible as a place of legal meetings for all the young people of the university, that its ranks would grow, that young people would realize the significance of the events taking place and could be helped to understand the situation clearly and to act. François Lescure worked with students with different political views, but managed to channel their efforts into resistance to the occupiers. Thanks to him, the Communist Union of Students and Lycée students in France provided invaluable assistance in organizing resistance to the occupiers and the policy of cooperation. Deploying legal work. The Communist students set up study groups in the Faculty of Natural Sciences, as was done in the Faculty of Humanities. The task of these study groups was officially to assist students in their academic work, but in fact they defended French culture and science against the ruinous influence of the Vichyistes and occupiers. Through all these activities, the influence of communist students grew. Here is what one of the students told me. One day at the Sorbonne, a professor was going to give an anti-Semitic lecture. We decided to hold a demonstration. A friend of ours had had eggs stored at home for 3 years. Assuming they were rotten, Tony Bloncourt and other students stuffed their pockets with them. As soon as the professor entered the auditorium, one of the students stood up and declared that the French would not tolerate his lecture. An uproar arose. The professor lost his temper and demanded that the police intervene, but the bewildered faculty administrator mumbled that it was not customary to let the police into the university. After that, the eggs came into action. The professor turned pale with fear, and when one egg hit him in the head, he ran away. "Alas," said my comrade, "the eggs were fresh, and that is so rare." Another time, a Vichyist intended to give a lecture at a scientific society for students on the subject of the chosen of this world. We planned a demonstration, and the police prefecture took action. Police vans were concentrated on the approaches to the auditorium. A group of young supporters of Marshal Pétain had gathered in the lecture hall. They were to applaud the Vichyist sermons. The lecturer began by saying that he had asked for a large lecture hall at the Sorbonne, but that he had been refused by someone in charge of the university. Immediately there was applause and cries of "Long live the rector." Pétain's supporters did not understand any of this and also began to applaud. The lecturer at first tried to say something, but then finally lost his way. The applause grew stronger. Even before the lecture began, the communist students noticed that there was no portrait of Pétain in the audience. One of them took advantage of this and asked the lecturer with contrived indignity. The marshal's supporters applauded the loudest along with the other students who had caught on to the ruse. The lecturer became confused and left the audience. Thus, despite the police cordon, the lecture was disrupted. Such actions prepared the unfolding of a broad struggle in the Latin Quarter, a struggle that had national and international significance. Alas, the communist students Jean-Charles Canal, Christian Rizot and Raymond Itimo were unable to take part in it. They were thrown into prison. Jean-Charles Canal was arrested on September 26, 1940. "We spent whole days in the library of Sainte Geneviève," he recounted. "We spread leaflets in the flights of stairwells, taking advantage of the free hours in the schedule. While leafing through books, we would discreetly put leaflets in them. Pierre Cast proved to be a particularly great expert in this matter, but the main work was done from darkness until curfew, which began at 11 o'clock in the evening. Under cover of the darkness, we crept stealthily through the streets of the Latin Quarter, slipping brochures under doors and pasting leaflets. It seemed easy, but in reality it was very dangerous, because we were not the only ones walking the streets. There were motorized patrols everywhere. It was in these conditions that I was captured on September 26, 1940, a few minutes before curfew, while pasting major doors of the examination building on Rue Mabillon. I had to visit the prisons of Santy, Chermidi and Fresnay. Jean-sur-Canal, along with other communist students, was convicted on November 2, 1940, just days before the major student demonstrations in Paris. The students were not alone. Many professors took every opportunity in their lectures to defend freedom of speech, national independence, and human dignity. Raymond Burgard, Edmond Leblany, Jacques Decours, Radra, Favros, Maublin, François Engrand, Husson, Charmoyot, René Baudouin, de Caylus. In the face of the unfolding protest movement in university, intellectual, student and lycée circles, the Nazis decided to strike back. On October 13, 1940, the scientist Paul Langevin was arrested. Paul Langevin, one of the most worthy representatives of science, the embodiment of French humanism. Together with Romain Rolland and Henri Barbès before the war, he took part in the movement against war and fascism, as early as December 26, 1938. At the National Conference in Gennevilliers, he noted, "It is a matter of honour for your party to link theory and practice closely. They say that a communist must constantly study. I want to tell you that the more educated I am, the more right I have to be called a communist. Only your party has clear ideas. It is a kind of development of the ideas of the French Revolution." By arresting Paul Langevin, the occupiers hoped to strike a simultaneous blow against French science and everything that represented freedom, human dignity, and resistance to Nazism. The response to the arrest followed immediately. In the premises of the French National Union of Students in Place Saint-Michel, a leaflet was secretly printed and then distributed. Students. Lyceum students. The arrest of Professor Paul Langevin shows that the dark forces have moved to an open struggle against culture and free thought. Rippert's reform, the closing of the teacher training colleges, the measures to deny French women access to the university, mean a return to the Middle Ages. The senile Pétain Laval, Rippert and their gang, acting at the behest of the occupiers, make no secret of their intention to enslave France both spiritually and economically. Young intellectuals, lift up your comrades, your professors, your teachers. Demand the immediate release of Professor Paul Langevin. The Communist Union of Students and Lycées of France. All over the Latin Quarter, there were signs saying "Free Langevin." The Germans arrested the scientist in his office at the Institute of Applied Physics and Chemistry, of which he was director. He was taken in an automobile first past the Orleans Gate to the Fresnes prison, but near Longjumeau the automobile turned around and the prisoner was taken to the Santy prison. Here, 68-year-old Paul Langevin was imprisoned in a cell with the criminals. In prison, despite the protests of the world community, he remained until December 7, 1940. With the active assistance of the Underground Communist Party and the Union of Communist Youth, the Committee for the Defense of Professors and Students of the University of Paris was established. For several weeks, the idea of holding a demonstration on the occasion of the anniversary of the events of November 11, 1918 had been brewing. This idea was put forward by the National Union of Students of France. Therefore, the proclamation drafted and printed within the walls of this union called for 2 demonstrations. In defense of Langevin and in honor of the commemorative events of 1918. Students. Protesting against the arrest of Professor Langevin, against the censorship of our books, against the presence of the Gestapo in our classrooms, against the enslavement of the University of France, assemble on Friday, November 8, at 4 p.m. at the Collège de France, where Professor Langevin was to give a lecture. Remain calm, give no reason for reprisals. On November 11, organize a commemorative demonstration in the faculties and institutes. Despite the siege of the Latin Quarter by large police forces and the presence of German armoured cars driving along the Boulevard Saint-Michel, the first student demonstration took place on November 8, 1940. Its success contributed to the preparation of the November 11 demonstration at Place du Toil. The idea of a demonstration on the Place du Toil, testifies François Descure, makes its way. It penetrates the most diverse circles, especially among the high school lycée students. It is supported both by the first Gaullists and by representatives of other movements. On the one hand, there were anti-fascists, on the other patriots with vague political views, and even nationalists. a new phenomenon that immediately struck us with its importance in terms of the prospects for unity of action against collaboration and occupation. We must not forget that in the bourgeois and petit bourgeois milieu, the loudest call was for submission, for patience with the defeated who had paid the price for the popular front, and even for consolation that the Germans had come to restore order. François Lescure, Secretary of the Union of Communist Youth and General Secretary of the National Union of Students of France in the occupied territory, and Rocher Marais, President of the Union's Humanitarian Corporation, jointly issued a call for a demonstration in the Place d'Étoile. Professor Raymond Josse found this leaflet. It was printed in La Revue d'Histoire de la Seconde Guerre mondiale No. 47 of July 1962. French student. The day of November 11 is still your national holiday. Contrary to the order of the occupation authorities to ban the manifestation, it will be a day of unity. You will not go to class. You will honor the tomb of the unknown soldier at 5:30 p.m. The day of November 11, 1918 was a day of great victory. The day of November 11, 1940 will be a day of even greater victory. All students proclaim Vive la France. On November 10, 1940, the newspapers and radio again said that any demonstrations on November 11 were forbidden. The prefecture of police stated, "The public services and private enterprises of Paris and the Seine Department will operate as usual on November 11. No commemorative ceremonies will take place. No public demonstrations will be allowed." This prohibition, imposed after Petain's meeting with Hitler on October 24 in Montoire, which symbolized the subjugation of France, gave special significance to the November 11, 1940 demonstration. The appeal of London radio also contributed to this. However, Raymond Josse emphasized, the appeals of London radio were not addressed to students in particular. They were general appeals intended for the entire population of Paris, with no indication of the time and specific nature of the action, but simply, apparently, to appear in the crowd on the Champs-Élysées and lay flowers at the tomb of the unknown soldier and at the statue of Georges Clemenceau. One thing was clear: how to proceed was decided not in London, but on the spot in Paris. It was the joint efforts of communist students and other groups belonging to different political currents that led to the march to the Place d'Étoile. Already in the morning, several people of various ages came from the Champs-Élysées and decorated the tomb of the unknown soldier and the statue of Clemenceau with flowers. The demonstration was supposed to start at 5 or 6:30 in the evening. But as early as 4 o'clock in the afternoon, groups of high school students and lycée students began to gather at the top of the Champs-Élysées. The first incidents took place at 5:30 at number 144 on the Champs-Élysées, where members of the pro-Nazi organizations Young Front and French Guard were on permanent duty. The young fascists were dressed in uniforms, wearing harnesses, marching along the street, shouting insolently to provoke a clash. Several hundred people gathered in front of the house. Jokes against the fascists were heard. German soldiers intervened. French Nazis pointed them to the 5 most active students, who were immediately arrested. At the same time, a large column of students from the Lycée Janson de Sailly, led by Professor Edmond Lablany, came from the Rue Victor Hugo. A short time later, another group of students from the same lycée arrived. It was led by a young communist, lycée student Ivan Denis. Following the students of the Lycée Janson de Sailly came representatives of the lycées Condorcet, Carnot, and Buffet. Soon teachers, students and lycée students lined up in large groups on the Place d'Étoile. On the streets of Balzac and Washington, on the Champs-Élysées and in some other parts of the city. How many were there? 3, 10,000? Various figures are now quoted. History is often unfair. They speak of a student demonstration, while in reality there were as many or slightly more high school lycée students. At this time, the Paris police, together with German soldiers, began arrests. Dozens of people were seized. Not the least bit timid. The demonstrators reorganized themselves. A long column tried to go to the Arc de Triomphe to honor the tomb of the unknown soldier. At 6 o'clock in the evening, a platoon of German infantry with hand machine guns took up a position on the Rond-Point. A short time later, another platoon arrived by automobile and blockaded the Champs-Élysées near Rue Georges V. The police began to drive away those who tried to approach the tomb of the unknown soldier. They were actively assisted by German soldiers. Cars with soldiers moved along the sidewalks and side alleys, crowding the demonstrators. Tensions were rising in the surrounding streets as well. German soldiers chased the demonstrators, threw grenades, fired from handheld machine guns. Blood was spilling, the number of arrested people was growing. French police and German soldiers managed to gain the upper hand on the Champs-Élysées and its environs. Around 7 p.m., the last groups of demonstrators dispersed. Still, the main point was that lycée students, teachers, and students had demonstrated on November 11 under the occupation of the country, despite the prohibitions of the Pétain authorities. For the first time since June 1940, there was a sharp mass clash between Frenchmen of different political directions and the occupation troops. Were there any fatalities? The Communist Union of Students and Lyceum students wrote in one of its leaflets that 5 people had been killed, while London radio reported that the number killed was 11. On this point, I join the opinion of historians such as Raymond Josse. They believe that both figures quoted are at least exaggerated. Since 1940, no organizations, families, institutions have reported the names of the victims. However, some light must be shed on how the young lycée student Raymond Jolt died. The police insisted on the version that he was released the same evening, November 11. Raymond Jolt studied at the lycée and practiced medicine. He lived with his parents in Versailles. He was found under the arch of the Cévise Bridge with a face mutilated beyond recognition. The doctor determined that death occurred before the young man was in the water. What was it? An accident, or was Jolt one of the victims who fell on the Champs-Élysées on November 11, 1940? Or was he murdered in prison, and then his body thrown into the scene to create a version of an accident? In any case, the newspaper Le Führer only reported the death of Raymond Jolt in the incident section on November 19 and 21. The same uncertainty surrounds the 5 arrestees tried by the military tribunal. 3 are the science teacher René Badouin, sentenced to a year's imprisonment and released on July 24, 1941, and 2 of his students, Laurent, sentenced to 6 months, and Ligov, sentenced to 6 weeks imprisonment. The names of 2 others are unknown to date. Whatever happened to the students, Lyceum faculty of the university in 1940? We are now far from indifferent to the fact that Nazi soldiers shot at them. There were dead and wounded. The German military command and the Vichy government did not dare to tell the truth. Nothing was reported in the press or on the radio about the demonstration. The Germans ordered silence. Yet on Saturday, November 16, they found themselves unable to continue the blackout. The newspapers printed the following report. Groups consisting mainly of students abused their confidence on the day of November 11, and despite the official prohibition of demonstrations, organized noisy demonstrations in the streets. In order to restore order, it became necessary for the relevant services of the occupation authorities to intervene. Because of these demonstrations, which offended the dignity of the German army, the commander of the troops in France ordered the closure of the university in Paris. On November 22, 1940, it was the turn of the lackeys in livery. The Nazi Doriots newspaper Cri du People began harassing the criminals. These included, according to the newspaper, young Jews, young social communists, rotten Freemasonic youth, and adherents of the king. The university was closed for 5 weeks. Students were humiliated, required to report daily to the police station of their place of residence to be marked. Rector Roussy and General Secretary Maurice Guyot were removed from their posts. In many lycées, entire classes were subjected to house arrest. At the demand of the Nazis, the police prefecture took repressive measures. It was clear to them that a real underground organization was at work, in which communist students played a major role. On November 29, the front page of the newspaper L'Heure reported, Communist Student Organization uncovered. Important materials seized, 19 people arrested. Another collaborationist newspaper, Matin, on the same day wrote, all educational institutions in Paris were divided into 3 sectors. Under the head of each sector, there was a commissioner, a specialist of a certain kind of activity. The inspirer of this dangerous movement was Maurice Delon, an employee of the mayor's office of the II arrondissement, and the executors were Jane Rosinoa, a medical student, and Claude Lelate, a student of the philological faculty. The former was charged with distributing leaflets in the university environment. The second ensured the production and distribution of the leaflets. For this purpose, the troublemakers had portable multiplying machines and a large supply of paper in one of their rooms. The leaders of all 3 sectors, Babard Kirchen, Oman bin Alea, and Claude Lalaye, were arrested. Other students and female students who were their accomplices were also arrested. The arrest of 19 communist students who played a major role in the July 1940 demonstrations, and especially on November 8 and 11, was the result of both measures taken by the police prefecture and carelessness in their work. A comrade entered the names of some students in his notebook without giving addresses or any other information. But the police, finding materials intended for students in his possession, rushed to the faculties, searched for addresses, and arrested everyone on the list. After this police raid, the leadership of the student organizations took measures to prevent further arrests, including conspiratorial measures. The struggle did not stop, but it had to be conducted in a more difficult environment. At the same time, more and more thousands of students and lyceum students joined the ranks of the struggle. After the November arrests, a new leadership of the Union of Students in Paris was appointed. It included Léon Lavallee, Suzanne Gian, and Pierre Noël. On December 1, 1940, the new leaders of the Communist Union of Students and Lycée reported that, despite the arrests, the number of communist students had increased. There were now more of them than before November 11. The young communist newspaper, L'Avant-Garde, on November 26, 1940, set the example of the activity of the students who participated in the November 11 demonstration. One of the leaflets issued by the Communist Union of Students and Lycées of France, French students demonstrated on November 11. Truth is on their side. They thus confirmed their determination to fight for the freedom and independence of France. This is the sacred duty of French youth, and the puppet Vichy government and the occupation authorities consider it a crime. The students are resisting enslavement. They are right. They are fighting against the enslavement of France. Long live the unity of the students in the struggle against the oppressors. Long live the unity of the French nation in the struggle for the freedom and independence of France. These first demonstrations on November 8 and 11 on the Champs-Élysées put an imprint on all the subsequent actions of the university professors, students and lycée students. Students, lycée students, and professors struck the first blow against the occupiers and their attempt to enslave France and the university under the guise of cooperation. For the first time, leftist students found themselves in line with Catholic students, and even with nationalists. Francis Cohen, General Secretary of the Communist Union of Students and Lycée Students, wrote with good reason in 1940. Events confirmed that the only organized political force that took part in the demonstrations was the Communists. Along with this, numerous representatives of various democratic and patriotic trends joined the movement. This is the historical significance of the demonstrations of November 11, 1940, that they were destined to reflect the very essence of the resistance in France. The first workers' demonstrations. In July 1940, the refugees returned to their homes. The workers faced the problems of employment and subsistence. Unemployment took on enormous proportions. The Nièvre Valley is in the Somme department. In 1940, it was known as the Valley of Poverty. Here everything was at the mercy of the owners of a textile company, from which the owners dismissed 14,000 workers and women employees because of the reduction in production. Their enterprises resumed operations, struggles broke out. In July 1940, the Communist Party, through the underground newspaper Humanite, called for the creation of popular committees of solidarity and mutual aid. Already in July, August and September 1940, such people's committees began to work in many enterprises. At the farm and factory in Boulogne-Billancourt, 4,000 workers achieved the payment of wages. Each received an average of 2,300 francs. At the enterprise Bardet in Paris, at the request of the People's Committee workers, were given 1,000 francs. In the association, Escape workers achieved an increase in wages of 0.85 francs per hour. 500 railroad workers at Elema went on strike demanding better supplies. In Lieven, strikes were held on August 30-31 and September 7, 1940, to protest the harassment of a grinder for demanding 80 francs instead of the 62 francs given by the company administration. In Limoges and Clermont-Ferrand, protests were announced against the dismissal of married women from work. The first workers' demonstrations in the industrial centres of the occupied zone of the country, including strikes, showed that the working class had no intention of tolerating the oppression of national capital and the occupiers. However, in organizing these demonstrations, the difficulties of combining legal and illegal work were real. workers withdrew from the unions led by Petain's supporters. On this occasion, Benoit Franchen wrote in September 1940 in the illegally published newspaper Human. The capitalists expected that the workers would be disgusted with unions whose leaders would be only servants of the authorities. This, unfortunately, is what happened. We have constantly said, and we repeat now, that by acting in this way the workers have made a mistake. This mistake must be corrected. Everyone must regain his place in the union. It is necessary to overcome this aversion, because the fewer union members there are, the more the traitor bosses have their hands free. Their decisions, their conciliation are clearly contrary to the will of the masses, but how can the will of the masses prevail if they are unorganized? On the other hand, there is no doubt that there are hundreds of activists who were carried away and deceived by the traitor bosses, but today have realized that they were mistaken. Louis Idier, secretary of the Metal Workers' Union of Le Havre, following this advice, managed to organize a number of major workers' demonstrations. In August 1940, he led a demonstration of the unemployed. Together with industrial workers' representatives Richard and Panel, he was part of a delegation which was received by the sous-prefect and succeeded in getting the unemployed to receive a lump sum allowance. At the beginning of 1941, the Metal Workers' Union of Le Havre had 1,100 members, while other unions were very small. Material assets belonging to the legally existing union were placed at the disposal of underground organizations. The work of the union was led by anti-fascists, who managed to establish illegal organizations in all large enterprises. After much persecution, on July 9, 1941, Louis Idier was arrested by the German police and sent to a camp. However, what he had done in 1940-1941 formed the basis for the actions of the Havre resistance. On February 15, 1941, during a union meeting at the Labour Exchange in Paris, the official speaker was forced to interrupt his speech. Those present insisted on electing a commission to work out demands for higher wages. Thereafter, the police prefecture banned all union meetings altogether. In April 1941, in Lyon, 150 union delegates booed two speakers from Vichy. An illegally published newspaper of the Popular Committees of the Paris, Basin printed in April 1940 a large list of enterprises where workers' demonstrations had ended in victory, and among them were Cute in Argoli, Stang in Vincennes, Hispano in Colombes, Gnome et Ron in Gennevilliers, Comcame and Gordon in Saint-Maur, Plejol and Silex in Bagnol. And everywhere the wages rose by 2 francs an hour. This showed that the struggle was waged everywhere, that it was organized. The workers at Gnome et Ron, Lafley, Citron had secured the payment of an 80-hour penalty for the reduction in production. On April 7, 1941, 3,000 workers of the factory Raffia in Issy-les-Moulineaux in Weich went on strike. Here gun camouflage nets were manufactured for the needs of the German army. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the first shift stopped work, and the second shift did the same at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The police dispersed a column of demonstrators marching toward the military commandant's office in Montrouge. 17 women were arrested and handed over to the Germans. One of the militant groups made several attempts to set fire to the commandant's building. Mass demonstrations took place. The essential role played by women and girls during the occupation, under the leadership of Danielle Casanova, Maria Rebate and Claudine Chaumer, can never be sufficiently revealed anywhere. The Union of French Women and various women's committees, such as the Committee of Wives of Prisoners, the Committee of Housewives and other organizations, undertook tasks that were not at all peculiar to them, but were of paramount importance. In 1940, there were several women's demonstrations. 300 gathered in front of the town hall in Rouly, 500 in Montrequieu and Ivry, 400 in Bagnolet. They all demanded milk for children, better food and coal supplies. In Salamine and Bethune, in Denain, women besieged the town hall almost all day long. On April 15, 1940, 90 mothers and their children marched to the town hall of Sorteville-le-Roine. Mayor Tilloy tried to guffaw, but was forced to make a promise to let them have potatoes and beans. The same demonstration took place in Queverly outside the prefecture. On the same day in Rouen, 80 women came to the town hall, and the mayor was forced to call the police. On May 12, in Montevideo, 80 women delivered a petition with 560 signatures to the mayor's office. It demanded an improved food supply. In many other departments and localities, Similar demonstrations took place at the initiative of the Communists. The inter-district commissioner of the Communist Party, Albert Riegel, applied in Orleans a new method of action, which was then used by other party activists in neighbouring departments, particularly in the Department of Air and Lera. The fact is that Riegel had a list of wives and mothers of prisoners of war. On official forms, he sent invitations to all of them to come to Orleans City Hall to receive additional parcel vouchers for their husbands and children. At the appointed time, hundreds of invitees gathered at Orleans City Hall. The Vichy mayor was horrified and stated that there were no plans to send additional parcels to the prisoners of war. "We do not know who called us here," the assembled men replied to the mayor, "but it was done right all the same. And since we are all here now, we will not leave until our request is granted." The mayor contacted the prefect by telephone, and the prefect decided it would be better to meet the women's demands. The main event between June 1940 and June 1941 was a major strike of miners in the departments of Nord and Pas-de-Calais. It was prepared by all the preceding actions and lasted from May 27 to June 8, 1941. The Nazis and the owners of the coal companies sought to increase output. Mining of the richest ore veins began, and almost all the coal was shipped to Germany. The work was carried out without observing the most basic safety rules. There were daily accidents in the coal mines of the Nord and Pas-de-Calais departments. On September 4, 1940, at the coal mines of the Dejome concession in Derge, gas accumulated in the mine. 2 teenage Conagons died. They were Robert Guillaumin, a young communist, and Luc E. Mabel, a communist sympathizer. On the day of the funeral, the miners went on strike and took to the streets to see the dead off. Michel Brule, a miner from Dejome, secretary of an illegal organization of young communists, went to the days to make a farewell speech. A police commissioner rushed up to him shouting, "Metz Mort. Speeches are forbidden." The miners closed ranks around Michael Brule and blocked the policeman's path to him. "Note, do not cause a scandal," shouted the police commissioner. Michael threw the commissioner aside with a sharp movement of his hand and said, pointing to the coffin, "What scandal are you talking about, if here we see as many as 2 of them already?" Michael continued with his speech. He honoured his comrades, spoke of how the coal companies serving the occupiers were responsible for everything, and called on the miners to fight for their rights, to ensure safe working conditions in the mines. In solidarity with the miners, a strike began at the concessions in Aniche and Escarpel. In Dorigny, 30 miners were arrested at the 5th mine, and an Italian strike was called in protest. At the mines in Oakhill, miners reduced output by 50%, seeking food rations from the company. The Derge strike resulted in the release of an arrested activist and the reinstatement of 5 men fired in connection with the November 1938 strike. On November 11, the miners, following the example of the students in Paris, held a demonstration. Despite instructions from the Vichy government and the German occupation authorities to consider November 11 a working day, the miners refused to go down into the mines. On the morning of February 21, 1941, 300 miners gathered to descend into the Dago mine. In the shower room, Michael Brule addressed them. He spoke of miners fainting because of inadequate food, of accidents, of the need for action. The mine foreman tried to silence Michel Brogolet, realizing that a strike could break out in the mine. "I forbid Michael Brogolet to go down the mine," shouted the foreman. "Then we'll go on strike," came the reply. The foreman called the German soldiers. The arriving gendarmes arrested Michael Brule and sent him to the district commandant's office in Bethune. A delegation of miners was immediately elected, demanding the release of their comrade. Calls for a strike were heard everywhere. The Germans transferred Michael Brule to Lille in the hope that the unrest will gradually subside. But the Dejome miners stopped work. The owners had to make concessions. February 25, Michel Brule was released. He returned to work. At the mine, he was met with flowers by women, old men, and young people of the workers' village. The entire mining basin of the departments of Nord and Pas-de-Calais was preparing for big battles. The impetus for further action was the strike of the Belgian miners in February 1941. A strike began in the first half and lasted for a week at the Sixbiers mine in Derge. In April and May, workers in the Douai and Valenciennes districts went on strike. After the May Day demonstrations and the Belgian miners' strike, the coal miners of France became convinced of the need for the unity of action, which the Communist Party had been talking about since March 1941. Committees of trade union and militant unity were set up in the mines of the departments of Nord and Pas-de-Calais. At their head stood such activists as Nestor Calonne, Leon Delphos, René Sixex, Charles Debarge, Michael Brühl, Georges Deray, Eugene Gloria, Jean-Baptiste Orgue, Jean Thies, André Lefebvre, Robert de Feckel, Roland Everard, Isidore Lobel, Julian Charles, Lebrun, Martin Gulsey. At 9 o'clock on the morning of May 26, the jackhammers at the Dayhome mine fell silent. Strike. The word was heard in all the galleries, and the tune of the International sounded more and more frequently. The German headquarters in Lille on June 27 sent a generalized report to the command, which assessed the situation as follows. At the heart of the past strike was deeply political objectives. The organizers cleverly exploited the unfavorable economic situation of the workers. The strike began in a mine that had already been flooded with communists for a number of years. According to information received from the French authorities, this mine had attracted attention even during the events preceding the strike. The enormous number of leaflets that have been discovered gives reason to conclude that a unified strike headquarters has been established. Agitators should be sought first of all in the ranks of the communists. The spearhead of the strike was directed against the capitalist entrepreneurs and the French government, and ultimately against German interests. It might be doubted whether all the strikers understood the political aims of the strike, but the fact remains that the overwhelming majority of French miners supported the communist call. The authors of the report were particularly irritated by the position of women during the strike. In their words, women blocked access to mines not covered by the strike in the most disgusting way. Indeed, miners' wives played a significant role in the strike. One of the heroes of the strike movement, miner Charles Debarge, wrote in his diary, "Our comrades, the French and Polish women, gave us considerable help in setting up strike pickets. They even held an entire demonstration the police had to use armed force. The women showed full solidarity with their husbands, sons, fathers. They replaced them on strike pickets when the street raids began. The disgusting way referred to in the German headquarters report was the way the miners' wives were treated by the Macker, that is, 'You go to work while our husbands are on strike. Shame on you, you filthy Macker.' With these words, the women grabbed the Macker, pulled off his jacket and pants, and he had to return home in his underwear. Young people played a leading role in the strike movement. A strike headquarters was established, headed by Michael Brühl and young communists. It was housed in Benoit Barbier's apartment in Auchel. In the northern districts, the youth movement was led by Germinal Martel, Felicien Joly, René Denis, Eusebio Ferrari, Armand Palwski, and the Bredoux brothers. The young communist newspaper El Avant-Garde wrote on June 9, 1941, "The occupiers have been able to see for themselves what the youth think of their cooperation. They seek to impose on them. Let them make it clear to themselves that our youth will never accept national oppression, that on the question of the national independence of our country, there is only one opinion in the ranks of the youth, namely to get rid of foreign domination as quickly as possible." Repression fell upon the workers of the entire coal basin. On June 3, 1941, a report from the German command stated that the ringleaders, 11 men and 2 women, were sentenced to terms of 2 to 5 years of hard labor. Street raids were becoming widespread. Charles Debarge wrote in his diary that 13 people were arrested in Gans alone. Oppression is repression, and the administration of the coal mines had to meet the basic demands of the miners. In June, Engineer Bruit addressed the miners with the words, "Go back to work. All your demands have been met, for safety regulations, for wages, and for food. What more do you want?" The response was, "Well, we need weapons." As his miners realized their strength. The May-June strike of 1941 was only the beginning of the War of the Mines. Charles Debarge wrote in his diary, "The Germans must realize that the working class has not signed a surrender, that it represents a force to be reckoned with.